Yale University, a pillar of education and excellence since before the founding of our nation. An institution wholly dedicated to cultivating 1,000 leaders of the world. Presidents, lawyers, journalists, scientists, senators. Well, at least as long as those leaders were white, wealthy, Protestant, and male. As the societal landscape shifted and evolved, Yale remained relatively the same, inaccessible except for those at the very top. A vestige of times long ago where social mobility was non-existent, where nearly everyone's father's father's father had attended, and where everyone wanted to find a pretty girl from an elite women's college and settle down. Enter the 60s. The 60s was an age of activism. American youth were taking to the streets to protest Jim Crow laws in the Vietnam War. This greater push for democratic ideals infiltrated every campus in America, and Yale students were not going to be left behind. Yale students also began embracing less rigid social norms, and they began pushing for women in the classroom. Finally, in 1968, Yale's president, Kingman Brewster, and the Yale Corporation relented, and the class of 1969 was Yale's first coeducational class. Just because there was support from the students, life as a woman at Yale wasn't easy, and even today it still isn't. The women at Yale displayed grit and drive to overcome seemingly indomitable barriers, and although their sacrifices highly benefit attendees post-coeducation today, the work of women at Yale still isn't finished. When President Kingman Brewster decided to admit women, he knew it wouldn't be a flawless transition, but he did set up some means to effectively introduce coeducation. Well, really only one. Elga Wasserman. Elga Wasserman was a tough-as-nails chemist with her PhD from Harvard. Her husband was a faculty member at Yale, and it became her sole duty to acclimate women to Yale, and she was afforded few resources to accomplish her mission. Wasserman knew that life would not be easy for women at Yale, so when admitting women, what did she and Secretary Sam Chauncey look for? Pure grit and resilience. To quote Chauncey, there was no point in taking a timid woman and putting her in this environment because it could crush you. From the lack of locks on doors to too few bathrooms on campus, the most harrowing difficulties that women faced were isolation, underestimation, and unwanted attention. Due to gender quotas kept in place by Kingman Brewster and the corporation, women were outnumbered at a ratio of 7-1. The women in the first class especially felt this ratio in the classroom.
It's basically 450 women and 4,000 men. And you know, when we came into class, I remember going to my first French literature class. I was the only woman in probably 50 or 60.
This isolation in the classroom made it difficult for women to form female friendships. Additionally, after freshman year, the women were scattered between Yale's 12 residential colleges and isolated from one another, and there were few opportunities for women to come together.
On no occasion during our whole time at Yale did they bring the women together. It occurred to them women might like to meet each other.
Women were also excluded from extracurriculars and found there was little life for them on campus.
And there was no life there for women. I mean, women weren't allowed in the gym. Women weren't allowed on any of the athletic teams. There was no women counselor or dean. I think their main concerns were just to keep the men happy that there were women there, and to some extent to prevent the men from having to deal with the unintended consequences of having women there.
The social mixers Yale's fraternities held, inviting women from elite women's colleges to Yale for the weekend, also still continued, and many Yale women felt slighted by the fact that part of their social fees went to these mixers. In regard to their relationships with men, women often faced two extremes.
Then you were constantly overwhelmed with guys kind of hitting on you all the time, and professors either hitting on you or insulting you for, having anything to say.
In class, women were often singled out and called on to provide a female perspective on course material. Some women also faced rampant sexism in the classroom from both peers and professors.
It wasn't unusual for some guy to come up to me and say, you're taking the place of a man, and all you're going to do is get married and have children, and you're never going to practice law. And that was pretty much typical.
I wanted to pick up an application for a Carnegie Teaching Fellowship. When I went to pick up the application, the English professor handing them out glared at me and said, "I think female fellows are an oxymoron, don't you?"
Yale University's own study on coeducation, the Green Report, picked up some of these comments as well.
We start turning the pages in the Green Report. What's a nice little mother like you wanting to go to graduate school? If you're going to be a TA, a teaching assistant for my course, I'd like you to sit out in the hall so that you don't distract the boys. I mean, the comments that the Green Committee picked up from people about coeducation and about the worries about admitting women were just extraordinary.
The struggles of the women of Yale led to some key changes, both at the university and nationally. Some Yale women formed a group called the Sisterhood, which lobbied the Yale Corporation to drop their blatantly sexist quotas. The corporation eventually did so. Elga Wasserman and her Committee on Coeducation conducted research on the treatment of women at Yale and on the tenure of Yale's few female professors that aided in the creation of important federal documents relating to coeducation, like Title IX. The women at Yale in the coming generations felt less of the isolation than the women in the first class, and they generally had positive experiences there.
I meet people from all sorts of different places, from different backgrounds, and it really opened up my world, and that was amazing.
However, full gender equity at Yale did not exist in all realms, especially in extracurriculars.
So there were still a lot of places on campus and groups and institutions and areas where women had entered, but women had not necessarily led.
It didn't bother me that there were men that were competing with me. I just tried, and so I was able to lead a few different organizations on campus and activities, and it just didn't seem to bother me.
So the largest student organization at Yale at that time was the Yale Political Union, and the first woman president of the Yale Political Union was in my class, as was the first woman head of the Yale marching band, and then of course I was the first woman editor of the news. So those were the barriers that were beginning to be. Leadership doesn't have to be male to be leadership.
The women who came after the first coeducational class had the same grit and drive to compete with their male peers for these coveted leadership roles. Until recently, however, some especially exclusive Yale organizations like secret societies and the Whiff and Poof Choral Group stayed all male. Even today, with the advent of the new wave feminist movement, there is still work to be done for women at Yale, even if they have filled leadership roles at numerous clubs and organizations on campus. Sexual violence is still prevalent at college campuses across the country, especially Yale, even with widespread activism in the #MeToo movement. According to a study conducted by Westat on sexual misconduct for the Association of American Universities, 18.1% of Yale students have experienced some kind of sexual assault, compared to the AAU aggregate data point of 13% on other campuses. Women also have not fully penetrated certain career paths and clubs. This is present at Yale and in the workforce.
Although there is a lot of support at Yale and lots of other undergraduate institutions for women to enter these fields that aren't known for having women in them, I think that a lot of people are scared to sort of go into those because they're notoriously male-dominated fields.
I'm in the ROTC program, and traditionally that's a very male-dominant group. The girl standards for physical fitness in the military are lower, but if you kind of just meet that minimum standard, you're not going to be respected as much, so you have to kind of aim for the male standards and kind of knock that out of the park too.
The women in the first class of Yale made huge sacrifices to break the coeducational barrier, and they did so with little social support and mentorship. The funny thing is,
While they were pioneers and barrier breakers, really what most of them were trying to do is just get the best education they have.
the women in the first class truly didn't see themselves as barrier breakers, only as scholars trying to get the best education possible. However, in doing so, they inadvertently broke the educational barrier long established at Yale.